of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Please be seated. It's interesting today that Luke offers our gospel parable with a preface or an instruction. He says, Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. So we know from the beginning of this story that this is what we are to take from it. This woman is so persistent with her pleas to the judge that he finally relents and grants her wish. On the surface, this would appear to be about praying over and over again, and if you pray hard enough, God will hear you. But there's more, so let's dig in. When we look at this parable, we might ask why Luke would tell this story in the first place, and then be so directive as to what he would expect his hearers to understand. The story does not appear in the other Gospels. Luke was writing, we know, at the latter part of the first century, long after the death of Jesus. The Jesus movement would now contain a number of converts, but clearly the original members, the ones that would have heard Jesus directly in person, would have passed away. We know that Paul had preached that Jesus was returning, and that returning was like tomorrow. And so these folks were waiting for his return. This new generation of believers, we know, was being oppressed, and the promise of salvation and their reunion with their beloved Christ did not exactly turn out yet. Perhaps Luke's intention in retelling the story is to encourage the followers not to be discouraged, to keep on keeping on. We know that Luke is recounting a parable told by Jesus, and again, we know what Luke wanted us to know. But what about the parable itself? As we have seen before, we've talked before, the parables are always deeper than they appear. And sometimes Jesus appears to be speaking in code, and he is really covertly criticizing that contemporary culture. And these parables are frequently obtuse, and so we have to look closely. And one way to look closely is to study the story's characters. First, of course, there's the woman in the story. She is a widow. We know that women, both in the Old and New Testaments, were very low on the social and economic scale. They could not own property. They could not appear in public without accompaniment. And most importantly for this story, they could not testify in court. When a woman lost her husband, she lost all means of support and would become dependent on another man for her survival. And this might work out for a woman with a living father or a brother, but for someone without a male for support, this woman would be destitute. This may be why we find numerous instances in the Old Testament in particular where the Israelites were directed by God to care for the widows or the orphans. So in Luke's parable, we find a woman who kept coming to the judge seeking, in her words, justice against my opponent. And again, consider the fact that this would have been truly unusual for a woman to appear before a judicial officer and to speak her complaint directly. What might her dilemma have been? We're not told. But because she was a widow and probably poor and did appear before the judge without a male advocate, she must have been very desperate desperate enough to go against the social conventions of the time. And perhaps the matter had to do with land, perhaps her home that her husband had owned upon his death. Perhaps there were competing claims against that property. In any event, she had no recourse against her opponent but to bring him before this tribunal. And this woman was unusually determined and brave. So Jesus is using a woman at the margins to tell this story about God, that God will not delay in granting justice. Then we look at the judge. It's not difficult to read into this story that he was a corrupt judicial officer. Jesus describes he was not afraid of God and cared little for anyone else. Historians tell us that bribes and other wrongdoing both in the Jewish Torah courts as well as the Roman civil courts were common. This judge would have been interested in ruling in favor of those with power, those able to pay a bribe, as opposed to this woman who clearly had little resources to influence a result in her favor. And we know that the judge was compelled to grant justice not because of the merits of her claim or any sense of compassion, but because she pestered him. And while the temptation is great to compare this judge to God, we should wait and tease this out a little further. There are other characters not mentioned in this story that we can explore with our theological imagination. Perhaps this woman was desperate not for herself, but for her children. It was certainly not uncommon in those times for a man with a wife and children to die at an early age, leaving the wife a widow and the children as orphans with no means of support. I suggest to you that the children of this woman are standing there beside her, unsupported and vulnerable. We might ask, who are our widows? Who are our orphans today? And some of today's widows are the single parents of color, comprising the working poor here in our city. And their children are present-day orphans. How are our orphans, our poor and vulnerable children, facing today? The statistics are staggering. The following national information on childhood poverty is written on the website of the Children's Defense Fund, and I will read from that report. Even before the pandemic, children, particularly children of color and very young children, were the poorest Americans. More than 10 million children lived in poverty in 2019, the most recent year in which the United States Census poverty data are available. The child poverty rate is 1.5 times higher than for adults. Children are 1.5 times more likely to be poor than grown-ups. And almost half of the children in poverty live in extreme poverty. And by extreme poverty, the definition is an annual income of $13,000 for a family of 4. A little over $1,000 a month for 4 people. Historic systemic racism and institutional barriers mean that children of color have been particularly vulnerable to child poverty. Black and Hispanic children experience some of the highest poverty rates in the country. 71% of the children in poverty in 2019 were children of color. Nearly 1 in 5 children in color in America were poor. And children of color were 2.5 times more likely to be poor than their white, non-Hispanic parents. Nearly 1 in 6 infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, little babies up to 5-year-olds, were poor. And 1 in 4 black children were poor. And even more troubling, close to home, the 2019 figures from the U.S. Census Bureau, I'm not kidding you, nearly 40% of children living in the city of St. Louis live in poverty. The resulting youth poverty rate in St. Louis City ranks as the 12th lowest amongst, not lowest, worst. You're the 12th worst city in the country, tied with Milwaukee. And to make matters worse, if they could be worse, October 2020 data from the Center on Poverty and Social Policy estimated that an additional 8 million Americans at the onset of COVID, including 2.5 million children, have fallen into poverty since May of 2020. So that all of that data tells us that child poverty is still very much with us in the city of St. Louis, and not getting any better. No matter what you hear from the pundits, 40% of the children living here in our city are poor. About 5 years ago, I was an intern at Trinity Episcopal Church over in the West End. And my first year there, I was in charge of the Sunday school. I was responsible for the children from 2nd through 5th grade. And on the first day of Sunday school, I met a tall, thin African-American boy of 10. We'll call him Kerry. He bounded into my classroom, and the first thing he said was, "I love God." I was a little overwhelmed, and I then said, "Well, so do I." And I was immediately touched by him. He shepherded his younger brother and sister who weren't willing to leave him, so they didn't go to their classrooms. They stayed with him. And when it got time to read the Bible story, I handed the book to this charming young man. And he struggled with the very simple text. And I realized, although he was in the 5th grade, he could not read. I finished the story. As the semester went on, I continued to watch him. He was kind and loving to his siblings, respectful to his mother, always willing to help me out in the classroom. And I worried then about his future. With this gentle disposition that he had, would he end up being led down a dangerous path? Without being able to read, could he even graduate from high school? I didn't find these outcomes acceptable. Some Trinity members started tutoring him, and by now he would be in high school. I wonder if that intervention was enough so late in his life. I thought of my own 2 children who had reading issues in grade school. I was able to leave work early to take them to a very expensive reading specialist, and we were able to keep them in good schools that had excellent resources. And years later now, our girls have graduated college and are now self-supporting. And I wonder, how is it possible that this child, Kerry, could get as far as the 5th grade and his teachers not recognize that he couldn't read? What about Kerry? And I consider that it is unacceptable that I had access to great resources that first identified my girls had some problems, addressed them, and eventually ameliorated, removed their learning problems, preparing to be the independent women that they are today. In contrast, Carrie's mother had very limited resources. She was a single parent of 3 children. And I know she attempted to work from time to time, but the city public schools had failed him, failed to identify him as needing help, failed to help him with his reading problems. She certainly did not have the resources that I had to arrest his reading problems and to secure his future. In our parable today, Jesus says, will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. I wonder if Jesus is referring here to the widows and orphans, people like Carrie and his mother. What would justice for Carrie be? These aren't easy questions, I know. They make us feel uncomfortable. To think of people, children of color living on the margins, continuing to be in need, unsupported, and vulnerable. In our baptismal covenant, we promise to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being. Every time there is a baptism, we say those words. We promise to care for our community. We promise to care for Carrie and his mother. And Carrie and others like him are the unnamed children standing behind the widow in our story, and their plight is unacceptable. Whatever seeds our prayers, our own concerns, perhaps the lack of stability in the larger world, just because it looks confounding or insurmountable does not mean that we give up. We can be like the widow and pray unceasingly. We can ask to be instruments of Christ. And God will not delay long in helping us. We don't know where or how God will lead us, but we do know that God will lead us. And we can count on God to be God. Our persistent prayer will be heard. In the words of my favorite homilist, our prayer keeps our hearts chasing after God's heart. It's how we bother God and how God bothers us back. Amen.